Hi friends. Today let us know about why 95% of Australia is empty. Almost everyone is aware that while Australia is a huge place in terms of land, it's also a pretty small place in terms of population. But few people truly understand the absolute scale of how sparsely populated the Australian continent actually is. To help put the numbers into some perspective, Australia is of a comparable size to it. With a population of just over 26 million in Australia and these 48 US states having a combined population of more than 300 million, only two American states, California and Texas, have a larger population than the entire continent of Australia. For a more European perspective, the population of just England, excluding the rest of the United Kingdom, is more than twice the population of the entire continent of Africa. Despite being an island that is 60 times smaller than Australia, the continent, Great Britain, Honshu, Luzon, Mindanao, Java, Sumatra, and Madagascar. Java alone has nearly 6 times Australia's tiny population. But it gets even stranger because there are a number of cities around the world that currently have more people than the entire continent. The Tokyo, Jakarta, and Delhi metropolitan areas all have greater populations than the continent. New York, Mexico City, and Sao Paulo. All things considered, Australia truly only has 5 major cities on its continent: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide, which together house approximately 2 out of every 3 Australian cities. Cairo, Lagos, Mumbai, and Moscow all have similar metropolitan populations to Australia as well. As a result, Australia is one of the most urbanized countries in the world, with 90% of the population living in a tiny number of densely populated metropolitan regions that make up only 0.22% of the country's total geographical area. These red areas are home to half of the country's inhabitants, and the other half almost entirely living in these blue areas. Overall, about 85% of all Australians reside within just 50 kilometers of the coastline, meaning that there is hardly anyone deeper into the vast interior. This unusual population distribution results in a number of fascinatingly bizarre situations across the continent. For instance, this is the Shire of East Pilbara in Western Australia. It is roughly the same size as Japan. It's actually just a small town with the space of Japan, but there are only slightly more than 10,000 people who live here, and half of them only reside in Newman. Perhaps even stranger, there is the pastoral unincorporated area down here in South Australia. With more than 1.3 million residents, Adelaide is Australia's 5th largest city. Immediately surrounding this oasis of urban life is the pastoral unincorporated area, a region about the size of France, but is only home to a meager 3,750 residents, making the population density something like 178 square kilometers of land for every single person, or roughly 1 Arubis worth of land for every single resident inside of the pastoral unincorporated area. Then there is also Anna Creek right over here, which is a huge territory that is slightly larger than Israel. Anna Creek isn't a nation or even a governmental organization. Rather, it is the largest privately owned cattle ranch in the entire world, according to Wikipedia, and it only employs 8 full-time workers. As a result, in this area the size of Israel, there are typically only a few people living there, along with about 10,000 cows. Consider the towns of Esperance on the south coast and Kununurra close to the north coast, both of which are located in the same state of Western Australia, to drive home the point even further. And it takes at least 35 hours to travel between them over a distance of more than 3,200 kilometers. Additionally, throughout that period, you may only pass by a population of less than 70,000 people. For contrast, the entire trip would take roughly the same amount of time and space as traveling across practically all of Europe from Madrid to Istanbul, where there would be much more than 70,000 people. Then why is Australia so devoid of people generally, and what is it about this continent that has allowed everything I just said to be possible? While there is some truth to this line of thinking, I am here to argue with you that that's only a small part of the overall population puzzle in Australia. After all, Everyone knows that Australia is covered in a big old desert with tons of super dangerous animals and insects. Who would ever want to actually live in most of the country? And the full explanation for why there are so few people on this continent is generally quite complex. Most of the issue comes from the fact that Australia is pretty particularly cursed from a geologic and geographic perspective because it is situated close to the frozen continent of Antarctica, and its western side is constantly battered by cold ocean currents coming up from the Southern Ocean, meaning that there isn't enough heat. Across the vastness of Australia's interior to the west, a so-called rain shadow is cast by the country's fifth longest mountain range, which runs down the eastern side of the country from north to south. This mountain range's height prevents many Pacific rain clouds from moving further into Australia than the immediate and narrow band of land between the mountains and the coastline. However, from a worldwide perspective, these mountains aren't all that spectacular. In fact, there are no very large mountains in Australia, and the continent as a whole has the lowest average elevation of all the continents, which makes rainfall a far bigger issue. Here, within the Great Dividing Range, Mount Kosciuszko is the tallest mountain and highest point that can be found anywhere in mainland Australia. It is just 2,228 meters above sea level. In contrast, every other inhabited continent's highest point is at least twice that height. The U.S. state of Colorado alone maintains an elevation that is much higher than just that single type of towering mountain in Australia across about 3/4 of the nation. Because the continent straddles the Tropic of Capricorn, a significant portion of northern Australia is well within the tropics, which means that there are simply very few tall mountains to be found anywhere on the continent that are actually capable of forcing air upwards where it can cool into rain. To make matters even worse, that air is frequently just too hot for rain to form anyway. The subtropical high-pressure belt dominates this region of the world, and it extends across the entire planet. It simultaneously serves to warm and dry the air around it, so whatever air is pushed upward by Australia's few tall mountains must also contend with this phenomenon. What's more, Australia must also contend with the unpredictable oscillations of the Southern Pacific Oscillation. La Nina. The Southern Pacific frequently experiences extended periods of slower than usual westerly winds during an El Niño event, which can sometimes last for years at a time. This naturally means that less atmospheric moisture will be delivered by those winds to the eastern and northern parts of the Australian continent, often accompanied by exacerbated drought-like conditions, so it's not surprising that many of the worst bushfires in Australia's history have taken place at those times. I mean, just look at this map of Australia's average rates of annual rainfall, where you can see most of the rain on the continent falls on the east coast in the stretch of land between the coastline and the Great Dividing Range in the north that stretches into the tropics, and as a result desert or desert-like conditions understandably exist over about 35% of the continent's total area. With the exception of one very interesting and notable region in northern Australia, where the issue is not that it gets little rain on average, the map of Australia's current population density pattern is virtually identical, particularly around Perth in the southwest corner and Tasmania in the south. Except that, like everywhere else in the tropics, it receives that rain mostly all at once and during ludicrously irregular time periods. Darwin, the largest city here on Australia's northern coast, experiences an average annual rainfall of more than 1,800 millimeters, which is nearly triple the amount of rainfall that London experiences. However, the vast majority of that rain falls during just the 4 months of the wet season between December and March, when the area's monsoon season is in full swing. The interior of northern Australia, between the coast in the north and the Tropic of Capricorn in the south, experiences some of the most highly erratic rainfall ever recorded on Earth. This is largely due to the area's unpredictable pattern of tropical cyclones. In 1898, one of these storms dumped an incredible 740 millimeters of rain over this small town in northern Australia in just one day. But a few decades later, in 1924, without any cyclones reaching the interior, this town only received 4 millimeters of rain, which is even less than the yearly average of the Sahara Desert. However, The scarcity of fresh water in this area isn't just due to the continent's unpredictable rainfall patterns, it's also due to the lack of any respectably large rivers. The Murray-Darling Basin, located in one of Australia's most densely populated regions, is the largest river system on the continent. But it just kind of stinks from the standpoint of building a large civilization. First of all, the system's waters flow southwestward and empty out right here on the south coast. This isn't really good because, as was previously mentioned, the majority of this basin is located in the area of Australia beyond the Great Dividing Range, where there isn't typically enough rainfall to replenish the rivers with water. As a result, the basin's average annual flow of waters is only 24,000 gi. One of the major river systems in the world has the lowest flow rate as a benchmark. The average annual flow of the Mississippi Basin in the United States is about 503,000 gigaliters, which is more than 22 times the annual flow of Australia's largest river system. Nevertheless, it is the best the continent has to offer, and the basin currently provides drinking water for almost 3 million Australians, while the region surrounding it has developed into the country's agricultural center, producing almost all of the country's food. That the 26 million people of Australia consume, as well as enough to export to millions more people in Asia, but as climate change worsens the effects of drought on the continent, the waters that feed this agricultural heartland through the Murray-Darling Basin are becoming more and more scarce with each passing decade. 9 of the 10 hottest years ever recorded in the history of the continent have occurred just since 2005. With already scarce rainfall in the majority of the basin due to these higher temperatures, the water is becoming increasingly scarce, with some sections of the basin occasionally remaining completely dry for months on end. Sustaining a very large population is difficult due to the lack of good land for farming as well as the increased rates of evaporation throughout the basin's waters. And a half billion years ago, and even further, there hasn't been any glacial activity here since the Carboniferous ended nearly 300 million years ago. As a result, this entire region, which makes up nearly half of the continent, has experienced continuous soil weathering and erosion for well over 250 million years, compared to less than 10,000 years for most soils on other continents like North America, Europe, or Asia. As a result, nearly everywhere in northerly latitudes has soil that is relatively free. These all reasons why 95% of Australia empty. Thank you for watching. Today I am winding up my video. If you like my channel, please subscribe and also enable the bell icon to get notification.